this is Veterans Day, this great day we set apart to honor our veterans and how they sacrificed, protected our liberty throughout history. And so we honor all our veterans today, and we're so very thankful to them. Marshall, you've been teaching liberty and American history for decades, and about these heroes, how they put their lives on the line to secure our freedom. But there's another great holiday event today that most people probably don't know about that's occurring today. I would say most Americans probably are unaware of it, that today, November 11th, 2020, is the 400th anniversary of the first constitutional document of freedom ever written in America. It's been called the Birth Certificate of America. It took place, Marshall, 400 years ago today. And I guess most people chiming in, they're probably wondering, how is that still relevant for us in our crisis, in our situation today?
Well, that's right. It's an amazing event. 400 years ago today, a small band of 102 strangers and immigrants who were actually, most of them, exiles from England in the midst of a persecuted Europe. These people coming in search of religious and civil liberty came across the ocean in a 66-day voyage on a little wine ship that no one thought would even make it. They barely made it, and they ended up 500 miles north of their intended destination. And they were blown into the rocks of Cape Cod and couldn't get around to go to New York, so they weighed anchor right there at the end of Cape Cod. And on November 11th, before they got off the ship, they realized they had no form of government because they were outside of the King's Charter in New York. They were out in these uncharted wilderness there in New England, and so they got together in the captain's cabin and they voted. It's interesting that we're just going through an election, which is not over to this day, continues, but that they chose to have a form of government. They created it in the captain's cabin, and they wrote it up. It's called the Mayflower Compact, about 300 words, and it starts out, "In the name of God, amen. We use names that underwritten, the loyal subjects of King James and it goes on and says, for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith and honor of king and country, we do," and then set up a form of government. And they submit to one another and to the election of leaders based upon their character. That form of government that was initially set up in that Mayflower Compact or Covenant was the foundational document that then was, of course, expanded from there and went and was developed by other settlers coming from Massachusetts Bay with their charter, and then Connecticut charter, which became the foundation of America's Constitution. But it was the Pilgrims who landed here 400 years ago today. They're the ones that laid out the first great Christian constitutional document of freedom. And that changed the course of history. And that's why we still have liberty today. And it's still relevant today because America and all the nations of the world are still ruled by the same principle, which is the principle of compact or covenant. We covenant with one another in our elections and in our form of government and in our relationships, but we covenant with God too. So it's a three-way covenant that ensures that our liberty can be maintained. That was all started on that day. There would be no need for veterans. There would be no Constitution. There would be no liberty. There would be no great America today had it not been for those desperate and yet faithful believers who came across the ocean that day 400 years ago.
You know, it's amazing, Marshall, on a day when, of course, Veterans Day today, we're honoring our heroes. But what makes these pilgrims so special? I'd like our audience to understand that, because when you think about how they saint and stranger, right? They agreed. They all weren't on the same page necessarily, but they agreed to come up with this liberating document, the Birth Certificate of America. Obviously, they were outcasts of society. They were, that's where they were called the separatists, right? They were separated from the Church of England and everything else going out there with the king trying to hunt them down and kill them. But it's amazing.
Right.
It's amazing to me to think what these people went through, the sacrifice on the ocean. Over 100 people crammed up on this little ship, enormous seas, bad weather that time of year. What they sacrificed, and they would never quit. It wasn't in their vocabulary. That's the one thing that really sticks out to me. And then Bradford, of course, their leader, William Bradford, said what they did, that when we were doing this film Monumental, that they were actually saying that it was the Mayflower Compact was more sure than any patent because they did it from their own minds, their own hearts. They had a say in the laws, right? And, of course, based on God's higher law. But Bradford said it was more than a patent, right? Because we were doing it ourselves.
Yes, and the thing that was unique is it wasn't a king's charter. In other words, the king was not dictating the terms. People fail to remember today that 95 to 96% of the people that have ever lived have lived under abject tyranny, under a tyrant, a king, a warlord, or an emperor. Only the very few, and most of them as a result of America's development, and the people in the history of the world have ever had freedom. And that this is the beginning of that freedom. They were facing a desolate wilderness. There was no one else in New England who understood biblical principles. The Native Americans needed to learn about them, but they had never been taught them because they didn't have a Christian background. Whereas the Pilgrims, and this is the uniqueness thing about them and those that followed after them, the Puritans, these people had been trained, and it took hundreds of years for first the Bible to be unleashed in the hands of the people in their own language, and then they had to decide whether they were going to have the king determine what's right or wrong, or whether God was going to determine it. He looked in the Bible and said, wait a minute, all men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. They understood these principles that we have put in our Declaration of Independence, but they understood them 200 years before the Declaration. And so they decided, even when they were in England, that they would not give up their liberty to have religious freedom and read their Bibles. They would not give up their children to an educational system that would teach against their freedoms under God. They wanted God to be the founder and the Bible to be the foundation. And then they would live in obedience to the laws of the land, but not when they went against God. And so they literally became outcasts, and they were exiled from the country. Weren't even allowed to be exiled, but they lost everything, their houses, their homes, their money. They basically were separated for years from their wives because they got separated in boats. But they came back together, and for 9 years, they lived in Holland. And it's interesting, it was that very moment in Leiden, Holland, where the greatest university in the world, University of Leiden, was the freest and greatest because it was the only place in the world that had freedom at the time. The Dutch were protecting these immigrants, and so they were able to study at the University of Leiden, and it was there that under Comenius and other Hebrew scholars who were also persecuted from other parts of Europe, they came together and began to study the great Hebrew model of a constitution and of a republic. And one of the professors, of course, at the university was the Pilgrim pastor, John Robinson. And John Robinson got to know Comenius. The two of them began to talk. And then, of course, Robinson taught his people. The people then learned the biblical principles of a republican form of government, electing good representatives who honored God, local self-government, keeping people accountable at the top, no kings. In Moses' era, and for 400 years after, there was no king in Israel. They lived under a republic. And so the Pilgrims followed that early model that had not been copied anywhere in the world. And when they came across the ocean then in the fall of 1620, they came across with no money, no gold, no power, a couple of animals, and every family had a Bible. The only treasure they had was that Bible. But when they landed, what they did is they took their biblical reasoning and their scriptures and their understanding of freedom, and they put it down in that document, the Mayflower Compact. And that became the foundation of their government, that they elected a representative to represent them, their mayor, every year for all the years after. They didn't trust government. They didn't trust their leaders. Mm-hmm. And they kept a free and a just government that then lasted long enough for the Puritans to come and then for others to settle in New England and all over America, so that the founding fathers could then develop 4 generations later and write our Declaration of Independence in our Constitution. But all of that was done because of those faithful warriors. They were truly the first veterans. If you talk Veterans Day, these are people, half of which died the first winter. They laid their lives down in the wilderness. They even said why they came. And right there in William Bradford, who was their governor, he wrote their only real book of their history called Of Plymouth Plantation. And right in chapter 4, he says of his autobiography of the Pilgrims, he said the first reason they came over was so that they could provide an example of liberty, that others could have a place of freedom. When the whole world, including all the tyrants of Europe, were persecuting people, there would be one place where freedom could last. And they said, we're willing to die in the wilderness and lay our lives down as stepping stones so that others can join us. Number one, they came for freedom. Number two, they came because they didn't want to die. It's always good. Survival is a good reason. They would have been killed otherwise if they didn't come. A third reason they came was to protect their children. They realized they were not able to train their children. Even in Holland, they were being forced into slave labor and forced onto ships, and they realized they wanted to train their children in the Bible. And the fourth reason, they said, last and not least, they cherished a great hope, an inward zeal of laying good foundations, or at least of making some way towards it, for the propagation and advancement of the gospel of the kingdom of Christ in the remotest parts of the world, even though they should be but stepping stones to others for the promotion of so great a work. There we go. That's their ultimate purpose. Lastly and not least, their purpose was to promote the gospel of Christ to the remotest parts of the world. And that's been America's gospel purpose, America's real purpose, I think, behind the scenes for the past 400 years. John.
Oh, it's amazing. And as you were saying that, it just really made me think why America is unique. It's because these people, the Pilgrims, they had faith in God. And obviously they live by his higher law. Not perfect, of course. You know, they're human beings. They made mistakes. But what must have been planted into their hearts and minds by their pastor, John Robinson, to do this, what a risk. I mean, what courage just think of yourself right now. It's winter, and you're going to hop on a little ship, right, a little wooden ship, and go across the ocean. I mean, and then signing the document, the Mayflower Compact, and I always remember the beginning words, for the glory of God. That's what it says. And you don't see other documents like that, today, in the advancement of the Christian faith. There aren't any. That was like the last one. If there's others, let me know. You're the great historian. The idea that, and here's the other thing, I assume people know this, but that document in itself is a government civil charter. It's not just, words. I mean, they're literally establishing a government civil charter, a charter. So, I think they knew, right? I wanted to, this leads to my next question. I think these people knew that God always used small groups they read the Bible. And so they knew that God used small groups of people that were totally committed to him. It wasn't always, the big crowd, right? But people that kept their agreement with God, their covenant with God, right? And with one another, to be faithful to God. They believed, even if it cost them their lives, and this is amazing, that God would bless their work in the long run. So as long as they did the right thing over the long haul, God would bless their work, even if they were gone, and a lot of them, like you said, they died, right? So what? Yeah. I'm trying to think further. What is the real significance in your mind of the Mayflower Compact that we celebrated today, November 11th?
Well, it's so significant even to this day because it was built on a covenant, a compact, and the compact today is just people that make up compacts, right? What is a compact? We don't talk much about compacts, but in reality, this is what America's government, why it's unique. It was not formed by a king who told you what to do. It was not formed by a mob who just came together like the French Revolution and said, liberté, fraternité, off with your head. It was formed based upon an understanding first of the scriptural principles of a constitutional republic, which were set down by Moses in the Bible. That means there is a form of government that works. It's like all things in the Bible. If we do what the Bible says, we're blessed. If we don't, there's a curse that comes with it. It's built into the way the world works. If you jump off the Empire State Building, you live for 3.8 seconds, and suddenly you're squished like a bug, right? You can't break the law of gravity. Well, there are laws of the universe, and so there's a relationship to government. God wants His people and all people to live in covenant with one another and with Him, in relationship, in other words. And so that agreement or covenant together is what built America, and it is a unique form of government that has never been successfully tried since that time of ancient Israel. And it was developed in America because of the biblical-based and Christian character content of the lives of the settlers that came over the next 150 years. And they went through a period where they developed their understanding. They trained their children to read. They were the most intelligent people in the entire world by 1776. And with almost 100% literacy as opposed to 3 and 4% literacy in places like France. So these people could reason, they could think, they understood, and they obeyed voluntarily the laws of the land because they had God in their hearts, and God caused them to want to do the right thing rather than the wrong thing. But even in their society, they needed to have laws that protected against evil, and so they set up these covenantal relationships, starting in these small towns, onto the colonies, and from the colonies out to develop our constitutional republic. But it's all foundational. And John, we need to blast this to America that our history has not been told. Our president, who is even to this day saying that we need to have within our schools and our educational system a true history of patriotic education and the heritage of our nation, yes, that needs to be broadcast to every school child, 66 million of them that are out there, so that our children will once again know this great heritage of freedom. You can't build freedom without knowledge and without understanding, without character. Freedom doesn't come because you get into a riot and say, heck no, we won't go, give us a free house, right?
Right.
It's built upon these principles, and that's the only way that liberty will last. And it's incumbent upon us to teach this. Ronald Reagan, in his final farewell address, he said, we're not teaching why the Pilgrims came to America. He said, that's our fundamental problem. He said, this is my one warning to you, America. He said it on January 19th of 1989. One warning, we're going to lose the spirit of America if we do not teach our children why did the Pilgrims come to America. And he warned us what was going to happen 31 years ago. And what has happened? Exactly what he predicted. We would be in a place of ignorance where half the country would be forgetful of these great principles. And that does not bode well unless we turn it around first in education and then standing for that liberty and not compromising it away.
Marshall, in light of our crisis today, I mean, you think of the political upheaval, what's going on is, we've heard the word unprecedented, right? And
yep.
And people are really confused. They're wondering what's going to happen next. And there's just an uncertainty that I don't think I've ever seen before in America. And but we could learn from these faithful pioneers of freedom, of liberty. We could, and that's why we're doing this program today, because they could teach us, right, about how to restore our nation. There is a solution, right?
Yes, that's right.
So Marshall, how do we restore our nation using their pattern, their program?
Well, it's interesting, John. You and I did a film together called Monumental with Kirk Cameron, and of course that film ends at the Forefathers Monument overlooking the Mayflower, overlooking the Pilgrims. And it was put on the top of that hill in the 1890s, 1880s. And the reason that giant, the number one and largest granite monument in America, it stands there for all to see. I recommend that everyone listening to us today get the movie Monumental as soon as possible and watch it. As I walked with Kirk around the monument, and you had been the executive producer of this entire film, and what we did there is go back and rehearse the principles that the Pilgrims left us for the restoration of the country. And it starts with faith in God, doesn't it? If we don't have faith in God and holding and opening and studying His Word, then there's no hope. And then secondly, morality. We must let that Word sink into our hearts, and we must be transformed by God so that we will live in obedience without being forced to, so that we will be kind to our neighbor and love our wives and children. That only comes through a heartfelt transformation that comes through faith in God and His Word. And then third, we must have laws that are built upon His principles, not built upon Karl Marx, because this is the Orwellian way that we're moving in America today. We're beginning to follow these selfish principles that have driven all the modern nations of the world, most of them, into this socialist hell that is developing in Europe and is swept through Asia and swept through the Soviet Union. We don't want to go that way. Let's go back to those principles of law that are built on the Scripture. And third, we must have a knowledge that's imparted to our children from the grandfathers to the fathers to the children. They must understand the ways of God, His matrix of freedom. And then the fourth part of that monument is this Liberty Man that you talk about so much in your book, the Liberty Book, where he's sitting there, and by doing it God's way, he has got the armor of a Roman soldier and giant muscles, but he's looking out to England and saying, listen, we're going to stand for our freedom, we're going to protect our children, and we're going to defeat tyranny, and we're going to do it by faith, not in the flesh, not just go out and kill somebody for fun. No. We will only defend, only defensively, but we're not going to let evil transform this country. Those basic principles are fundamental. They must be understood and taught. We're not going to win by winning one election. We're not going to win by bringing about some kind of a revolution that is unguided. But we must learn to stand properly, and in doing so, then God will honor that, and I believe America will be restored.
I do too, Marshall. And, the responsibility, it never left our hands, did it? Every dad, every mom, as you said earlier, it's faith in God that produces character. And to educate our children God's way, and then to elect liberty men and women who will carry the torch. The answer begins in your house. Get involved and secure a future for our children and grandchildren. God bless you. Thank you, Dr. Marshall Foster. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, brother.